I learned that Livingstone Fagin had his master's degree in philosophy from a university in England. At this moment, Livingstone is in a jail cell for the alleged crimes that he perpetrated on February 28th during the BATF attack. To make a long story short, I've come across a lot of information over my year here in Waco. During this time, I've lived with the survivors. I've talked with all of them. I've read all of the government reports. I think I've seen more videotape than I could possibly imagine at this point. Three things come to mind: demonization, cover-up, and disinformation. First, there was the demonization of David Koresh and the people that lived out here by the government through the media. This disinformation started on February 28th and has continued to this day. I hope that disinformation changes, or that demonization changes. I have an analogy. I believe that the government uses the media the way a military naval task force uses its battleships before invading a beachhead. Before they could deal with David Koresh, the government had to demonize David Koresh. They found the worst lies, the worst rumors they possibly could. Child sacrifices, they say, were going on here at Mount Carmel. Child abuse that had been investigated numerous times by social services and consistently dismissed because there was no evidence. There was no evidence because there was no abuse. This was known as early as 1990, but yet we never heard that side of the story. Then we got the whitewash. After Mount Carmel burned to the ground, the government had to cover its tracks by pointing fingers at every agency conceivable. The FBI blamed the ATF. The ATF blamed the FBI. Congressmen blamed each other. Presidents blamed attorney generals and heads of the BATF and heads of the FBI, ignoring the people who lost their lives out here, the individuals. And finally, and perhaps more damaging, recently there have been several so-called good people for truth that have been putting out disinformation and calling it fact. During my time here in Waco, I have tried to get to the bottom of what happened out here at Mount Carmel and not deal in theories. And believe me, we've heard some pretty bizarre theories. I've heard the theory, supposedly, actually I should say this was presented as fact, that David Koresh was working for the CIA and secretly building a gas bomb in the basement of Mount Carmel to use in a secret CIA black operation. I can tell you that isn't true. There's also a story that on February 28th, David Koresh's eldest son, Cyrus, was shot dead by BATF agents outside Mount Carmel. This information, of course, after all this time has just come to light, supposedly, even though we have video footage of Cyrus a week before the fire talking with David taken inside Mount Carmel during the siege, and Cyrus's body was found inside the concrete bunker after the fire. This false information has served to confuse the small element of people in the United States who have sought the truth out for themselves. A fact not supported by evidence, no matter how interesting or appealing that potential fact may be, is not a fact, it is a theory. And why deal in theories when we know the truth? So what do we know? On February 28, 1993, David Thibodeau, who was a Branch Davidian living inside Mount Carmel, was sitting inside the cafeteria writing a song. He was a songwriter and a drummer in David's band. David Koresh ran into the room. David Koresh said to David Thibodeau, who was sitting at the table, "They're coming. Don't anybody do anything stupid. Let's go talk to them. We want to work this out." David Koresh went towards the front door. At that point, David Thibodeau heard the sound of approaching helicopters. This was moments before the barrage of gunfire coming from the ATF and from these helicopters erupted. Catherine Madison, also a Branch Davidian, was up in her room towards the back of the property. She heard the sound of approaching helicopters at the same time David Thibodeau heard them coming. She looked out her window to see these three helicopters. There were two UH-60L Black Hawks and one Jet Ranger. These three helicopters were from the National Guard. The two Black Hawks came in low from the back of the property, between those trees we see off in the distance. As these black helicopters came in, there were two Black Hawks came in low. The Jet Ranger came in high. In the Jet Ranger was a camera crew, and Chuck Sirabayan, who was the ATF overall commander of the day, As the helicopters approached the back of the property, the two Black Hawks opened fire into what they thought was David Koresh's bedroom. This was witnessed by numerous survivors, and even testimony in San Antonio by ATF agents indicated that these helicopters fired on their initiating pass. As these helicopters opened fire from the back of the property, the two cattle trailers had pulled up out front, and as David Koresh came to the front door to work things out, to talk things out, David Koresh put his hands in the air as he opened the front door and said, "Wait, get back. We have women and children in here. Let's talk." At this point, as the helicopters opened fire, the agents at the front opened fire. And yes, it was proven in San Antonio that the BATF fired the first shots on February 28th. And as a result, all 11 of those Davidian individuals who were being held on trial for conspiracy to murder and murder of federal agents were acquitted of those charges. Because it is a fact, ladies and gentlemen, that the BATF fired first on that day. Later on, the FBI told us, told the world, that it was David Koresh who was not negotiating in good faith. But how do we know this? Because the FBI told us so. Based on the 911 negotiating tapes that we do have, and we have the first 12 hours of these negotiating tapes. These were primarily with agents of the ATF and the Waco Sheriff's Department. In these tapes, the ATF and later the FBI agreed not to send any men or material on the property. Yet that night, the evening of February 28th, despite the fact that David Koresh and the BATF had reached an agreement that the ATF would not set foot on the property, the BATF was on the property hours after that agreement making sniper nests. There's one over here. The building in the back of the property there where David Koresh used to paint the hot rods behind the quarantine area, there's a huge sniper nest in there. There's sniper nests all surrounding this area. All this, of course, was done at a time when the ATF had no business on the property and they were in violation of the agreements that they had made with David. The FBI, after they took over on the 3rd, after the BATF was relegated to crowd control and directing traffic, basically, along with the Texas Rangers, the FBI then got their tanks, and the FBI ran over every discernible above-ground object on Mount Carmel. That little pile of rubble over there between the main road and the driveway used to be a building. It is now a pile of sheet metal. That's what a tank does to a building. The vehicles were run over. Those vehicles that were not run over, their windows were smashed out with rifle butts, bashed in, the headlights were bashed in, the tires were slashed. All the belongings that were in the insides of all these vehicles out the front were thrown out in a big pile. Why? The BATF and the FBI acted like spoiled children with deadly toys, for the same reason why a juvenile delinquent scumbag will rip up a stop sign at 3 in the morning. The BATF and the FBI found it necessary to destroy as much property as they could get their hands on. Why? And as we sit here now, the same individuals that destroyed that bus by bashing out the windows with rifle butts and slashing the tires with bayonets are supposedly at this moment upholding our constitutional rights and protecting you and me. From who? The FBI further went back on negotiated promises when Rita Riddle, who is a Davidian inside Mount Carmel, she was going to come out, this was during the siege, to assist with the negotiation process. The deal was she would come out at a specifically designated time that was agreed on by both the FBI and David Koresh. She'd be taken into, quotes, custody. However, she would be given a phone call. She'd be able to call her 17-year-old daughter, Misty, who she was leaving behind inside Mount Carmel. She was to talk to David, tell him everything was okay, and then she was to take part in the negotiation process. Did that happen? That didn't happen. When Rita came out, they threw her down on the ground, handcuffed her, dragged her out into the road, surrounded her with tanks, put spotlights on her, strip searched her, dragged her down to jail, arrested her for conspiracy to murder federal agents, and that was the end of it. People want to know why those inside Mount Carmel did not come out over the course of 51 days. It's not hard to find reasonable reasons, at least not from their perspective.